Morning, Yasmina, and morning to everyone. If you're on the West Coast, I apologize for waking you up this early. We did do the online event this time a little bit earlier because we are hoping to include some of the people from Strata London, Strata Europe, which is coming up next week. I'm actually pretty excited to fly over to Europe very soon. And I know that there are a lot of people there who would like to join some of our online events, but they happen later in the day. So we've asked our West Coast friends to get up unreasonably early, and we apologize to all of them. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I think one of the things that we don't consider enough as we innovate in the fields of big data and connectivity is the ethical and moral consequences of how that changes us as a society. Selfishly, I get to go chase smart, interesting people and have them talk about such things, and so I've lined up three people I think are really, really pushing the envelope of understanding where this is taking us. And I apologize for my voice. I have been at conferences, including Strata last week, which was in New York and had 3,500 people and was crazy busy and probably a hotel full of pathogens, so I'm dealing with a bit of a cold. But hopefully that won't get in the way of me being a little bit provocative this morning. So what I want to talk to you about today is, before we get into some of the other presenters, is what I consider one of the real dilemmas and changes culturally we're going to have to make. In the 1970s bestseller, The Joy of Sex, we learn about a man who could only be aroused in a bathtub full of spaghetti. It's a real book, popular in the 70s. Now, back then he probably led a fairly lonely, normal life, albeit one in which he bought a lot of pasta and probably had a higher water bill than his neighbors. It's unlikely he had friends who shared his particular turn-on. The question that provokes is, how does your community define decency? Because that person might not have been considered normal within the realms of his or her community, but kept them to themselves. In Canada, where I live, we have certain sexual practices that even today are only legal when two people are present with no spectators. Before 1859, we relied on British law to prosecute some of these things. And in fact, Pierre Trudeau, one of our famous prime ministers, passed an omnibus bill, and that actually released Canada's last incarcerated homosexual in 1971. So these laws are fairly recent. In the U.S., you have similar controls. Until a 2003 Supreme Court ruling, many states outlawed specific sexual acts, and many of those laws remain on the books despite being invalidated by the High Court. In case you're curious about such things, in the U.S., the test for obscenity says that material must meet this three-pronged test. First of all, an average person applying contemporary community standards must find that the material appeals to a prurient interest. I'm not really sure what a prurient interest is, but I know it sounds dirty. It must depict or describe in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by applicable law, and taken as whole, it must lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Those sound like pretty vague definitions. And then we go on the Internet. And on the Internet, well, we are expected to understand what's normal. I could have taken this from any number of adult sites. In fact, this is a content advisory for a breast enlargement company. But this site, and most sites like it, say things like, this site contains adult material or materials that may be considered offensive in some communities. You may not enter this site if you are easily shocked or offended, or if the standards of your community do not allow for the viewing of adult erotic materials. In this particular case, it says you live in an area where such materials are considered a violation of decency standards. Well, this quickly raises the question, what's the standard of your community? I mean, we are in a world which is the end of mass market adult content. We no longer live in the world where everybody buys the same smut from the same store. Now the Internet gives us very unique, very tailored smut. And as a result of that, we are able to find a community online that's into whatever twists or turns we might be into. And that has a strange effect on us as humans. Because one of the things that we got to remember about the human race is that today our ravioli romancer can probably find his pasta porn very easily. And it's probably porn his geographic neighbors won't like, but his community isn't just the people next door. It's the people he hangs out with online. The web holds a lot more pasta porn for this person. It's where his friends are. And the more he hangs out with kindred spirits, the more likely he is to think that he is in some kind of majority. Surrounded by these same pasta fanciers or Daily Show fans or Tea Party protesters, whoever this is, we're suddenly emboldened. We suddenly feel like, because we found a large number of people relatively large to our tribal brains, we think we're part of a majority. So the Dunbar limit, which you may have heard of, suggests that we can track just under 200 interpersonal relationships. And this appears to be wired into us. Lower-level primates have different Dunbar numbers. So when you go out and find out that there are 150 people who like what you do, your reptile brain in your lower brain, sort of thinks that you're part of an empowered tribe. And this means that you start to ask yourself, am I right to be sort of part of a moral minority? You believe yourself to be entitled, part of what is, for your own personal context, a moral majority. And in your case of pasta, you might lobby for noodle subsidies or march in the streets or raise money for entirely new kinds of foodborne illness. But to the rest of the world, that person's still weird. Many people, each convinced that they are in the moral majority, is a horrible thing for consensus. These moral minorities emphasize how different we are from one another rather than exposing or exploring some kind of common ground. Rather than becoming tolerant of one another, we reinforce the perimeter defenses of our own tribe, something that's playing out right before our eyes in zero-sum games and scorched earth attitudes of, for example, American debates around taxation or health care or gay marriage. Ironically, a web that brings us closer to our peers distances us from the humanity around us because it polarizes us. And rather than a smooth fabric of consensus, tomorrow looks like a noisy quilt of special interests and squeaky wheels. Now, it's easy to forget that the Internet was built by hippies and hobbyists, idealists who are relatively free from commercial interests, and were far enough from the mainstream to escape regulation for a long time. We may one day remember the days of Usenet and Napster as the web's golden age, a time before regulation and governance. Fast forward 30 years, much has changed. The web is the key to winning hearts, minds, and elections. It can undermine regimes. It can expose corruption. Because it's so prevalent, of course, we try to legislate it. We inspect packets, take down content, sniff traffic, and put up firewalls. And this medium, this Internet medium, spawned by a utopian idealist, is looking more and more mainstream every day, which, of course, collides with the idea of independent communities and squeaky wheels finding a place to live out their alternative lifestyles. It's not much of a hiding place, this Internet we've built, when it's streamed into every phone, laptop, and living room. And that has really important consequences for how we legislate online behavior and how our culture deals with a commingling of public and private lives. Now, this next bit I want to attribute to Trevor Hughes, who did a great job explaining it when we were at Strata last week. The question really here is, how do we govern a coming citizenry of moral minorities? You may have heard of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. This is a prison that he thought could be designed where the guards could watch all the prisoners. And he observed that when our behavior is being watched, we change our behavior. And by not knowing whether you were being surveilled by the guards, you would change your behavior very efficiently. And he did this with the highest of intentions. But, some of the stuff he said sounded really creepy and really contemporary. It's a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind in a quantity hitherto without example. He called it a mill for grinding rogues honest, this world in which we were all surveilled. That's a pretty scary statement. He said, let me construct a prison based on this model of a few jailers observing the prisoners, and you'll see the jailer will have no salary, because as the jailers can't be seen, they don't even need to be there all the time. Just knowing that they might be being observed would allow the watchers to be the watched. It would leave the watching to the watched. That's a pretty scary look at the world. So how do we make rules when everyone's a freak? Are we going to self-censor and go to the lowest common denominator? That's a big challenge for our ethics as a society. First of all, legislators have to recognize that the web gives us the right to be weird at scale. Adult content has long placed the burden of decency on the consumer of that content. But the burden is really on all of us because now community standards are contextual, despite the fact that we hold people to a fixed standard based on where they live and where they vote. One day soon, someone is going to run for office, and someone who doesn't agree with him or her will leak the history of all the online porn they've ever watched. I'm amazed that this hasn't happened yet. Because scandal is relative. We'll have to decide whether a politician's behavior is scandalous because it's not acceptable to even the most vocal or restrictive communities, or whether it's his or her own business and therefore should be discounted. Now, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau famously said, when passing this omnibus bill back in the 70s, there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. But he also said, when it becomes public, it's a different matter. And now, as we live lives in the open, everything is public. There are three big problems we now have to deal with, which require that we rethink morality in a digital age. The first, of course, is that everything is available everywhere. The whole world's kink can leak into anyone's geographic community over a broadband connection, and you can find support for nearly any idea you might have if you look hard enough. The second is that we like to share a lot. Social networks, a sharing culture, and like-minded communities mean we make everything from sexual preference to religion to political bias a matter of public record, often with unbridled narcissism thrown in for good measure. And the third is that we have no common standards for decency. This idea of decent within the community that you reside is an entirely fungible, undefinable world. It's impossible to filter for decency at the source in a truly World Wide Web. If you need proof, just look at what Wikipedia is dealing with when it comes to material that some consider inappropriate. Censorship of the word breast when it applies to breast exams, for example, for cancer. We can either adopt a squeaky wheel standard of decency, banning anything that offends anyone and thereby ensuring that we'll be led by the blandest and most secretive among us, or we can accept that everyone's a bit weird, including lawmakers, and we can legislate from that starting point. Their nocturnal cravings shouldn't exclude them from a private or public life just because their private life doesn't fit with everyone's definition. As citizens of the web, we have to understand that just because we're in touch with like-minded freaks, that doesn't mean we're the majority. The web will pull back the veil of privacy, and our culture will adjust to a world in which everyone's a freak, and nobody's worse or better for it. If we give up our privacy, we need to gain some contextual tolerance. The walled gardens we so often decry are also the edges of our communities. What's acceptable at home won't fly at the office, as Facebook's new employers portal should remind us. Right and wrong aren't as simple as community standards anymore. We need to weigh someone's behavior according to the context in which it occurred. Privacy discussions aren't really about privacy at all. They're about the fact that our community's borders now change dynamically according to time, place, and medium. An internet with garden walls that forgets is a pretty good start. After all, good fences and a charitable forgiveness make good neighbors. But a generation that judges decency in the context of others' community and not their own is the basis for a connected civil society. We are going to have to come up with new lawmakers and new laws that understand the context in which someone exists and the context in which something was spoken. We aren't there yet, and legislation is far behind it. Ultimately, we need to amend the old golden rule. The golden rule says, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. What we need for the digital age is do unto others as you have them do unto you if you had their friends, their preferences, and their communities. Anything else is just imposing your worldview on the rest of the planet. So, needless to say, we live in a world with a lot of complexity and a lot of thorny edges where we're redefining the communities to which we are a member and what decency is within that world. I've asked our next three speakers to talk a little about balancing risk, about some of the interesting issues around bioethics and neuroscience, and also online privacy and analytics. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what our next three speakers have to say. I'm going to ask our first speaker, Cord, to join us. We have a couple of interesting background questions in here. Mitchell Silverman says that constitutional lawyer Lawrence Tribe described Lawrence versus Texas, the case that overruled the sodomy laws, and the case that upheld those laws, as the Brown versus Board of Education gay rights. All of this is said, obscenity in the U.S. is still determined by community standards, geographic communities. And this is absolutely the point. I think Mitchell's got a great point. We have to stop defining things by geographic community and start defining them by online contextual community. And because of the way that social networks barriers are fungible, we move between many of those communities. And so I think we tend to see a lot of issues around that. Richard asked, how does big data handle context? I don't have a good answer for that. I do think that big data is the trigger for redefining context because it allows us to find out what something's up to. The FBI could always dumpster dive and find out about you, but it couldn't do so with a simple click. And I think that's really the challenge here, is that the coefficient of friction for finding out what someone does has changed significantly. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Cord, and he's going to talk to us about balancing risk and innovation. Cord.
Good morning. Thank you, Alistair. And wow, I could spend the next hour just talking about that stuff. Thank you for some thought-provoking stuff, especially around this notion of context and community boundaries. I actually touch a little bit on that in a few slides, and I'll reference that when we get there. So good morning, everyone. Couple just informational things. I want to make sure I'm loaded up here. Yasmina, can you see me advancing slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm a recovering management consultant with Capgemini. Been in technology for about 20 years and have a actual degree in philosophy, which is, I think, one of the things that made me sort of sensitive to the context and the discussion around ethics and big data. I want to talk briefly about an exercise that I like to go through. And for people that are listening in, take a look at the matrix that's on the slide there. And there are two aspects that I'd like to talk about. One is from opaque to transparent, and the other is from proactive to reactive. And the idea is to kind of mentally chart where you might fall relative to your own private or personal data handling habits. So opaque meaning that you're very private, you share only selectively, you're fairly rigorous about how you manage your personal security and your passwords and account information. Transparent means that you check in on Foursquare everywhere you go. You post up pictures of what you're doing and what you're eating and all sorts of manner of personal daily activities online. Proactive means that you're very active in engaging in those things, so you change your passwords all the time. You're conscious of what networks you're on. You know what all your account information and login is. Reactive means that you really only do something different if privacy policy changes or there's a security breach or something happens there. So as we're moving through the discussion, just kind of think where you might fall in that on both of those spectrums and kind of mentally place your name on the board there. I'd also like to chat just briefly about the origin story for the book, Ethics of Big Data, because it's a pretty illustrative example of the issues that I think we're facing today. And Alistair did a great job of really raising some very specific topics around this. So starting about 3 or 4 years ago, I would be in a working meeting, and this happened a number of times. And there would be a technologist in the room, usually a database architect or some other person with deep technical expertise. And there would also be some product marketing or business marketing folks in the room. And as big data technologies and infrastructures were getting built out, technologists were realizing there was a lot of cool and novel, innovative business value things that we could do with the new technology. And so we would be in a working meeting, and the technologist would say something like, oh, by the way, we can now do X with our data. And one of the product marketing people would say, wow, that's really cool. Our customers are going to love that. And the second product marketing person would say, yeah, but that's kind of creepy, isn't it? And the first marketing person would say, no, I don't think so. I think it's pretty cool. I think our customers are going to like it. And the second person would say, no, that's just creepy. And they would go back and forth, yes, it's creepy, no, it's not, until I realized that in the absence of a common vocabulary and a common framework for talking about ethical questions in the context of a business environment, what happens is that we revert to our own individual personal moral codes, which is a fine place to start. And as Alistair pointed out just a minute ago, it's an even broader sort of amalgamation. Our own personal moral codes also are informed and influenced by the communities that we belong to, and that in the digital age, the communities that we belong to are being defined even more differently than they were prior to that. So I realized that one of the things I wanted to do, and this is a great online conference for kickstarting this, is to just start kickstarting more conversations around what is our common vocabulary for talking about ethical issues in the context of business and organizational environments. And one of the little bits of introduction I like to give around this is, so one of the challenges to having a productive and fruitful conversation is that ethics in business have an it's complicated kind of relationship. Ethics is a highly abstract topic, but both fortunately and unfortunately, it can have very real-world consequences. The thing to understand is that we understand how values inform our actions all of the time. We do it every day. We value our health because we value our health, we might eat a salad for lunch. Because we value our personal relationships, we remember the birthdays of our significant others, and we understand that the motivations for action that we take in our daily lives, in our personal lives, are motivated in large part by what we value. And one of the arguments that I try to make in the book is that in the context of big data, in any kind of organization, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, what we want to learn to do is how to better utilize our ability to talk about our values in the context of our data handling practices. And one of the reasons is because, and Alistair, again, adroitly pointed out very specific examples of how this is happening, big data is exerting what I call a forcing function on our values and our lives. There's a great historical example. In 1989, there was an American judge, Robert Bork, who was a nominee for the Supreme Court. And during the nomination process, somebody somehow got access to a list of all of the movies that he had rented from what at the time was the video store, and leaked that to the press and to the members of the Senate Confirmation Committee. And there was a big political uproar about it, and he was eventually denied the nomination. And one of the contributing factors was that a number of people thought that the kinds of movies that he was watching was very controversial. And so there was a phrase that came out of that. It's called getting borked. And as a result, in fact, very quickly, Congress passed what's called the Video Privacy Protection Act, which basically says that the kinds of movies that you watch can't be used as an assessment on your reputation in formal nomination situations and probably others. But the interesting part about that is that a mere 2 years later, our values have changed so much as a result of big data infrastructure and technology that Netflix actually asked its customers to lobby Congress to repeal that law so that people could actually share their movies with each other, because that was something that we now value. It was deemed interesting. It was an innovation that Netflix brought to the world, and people wanted to have that feature available, but they couldn't because it turned out that 21 years prior, Congress had passed a law that said it was illegal to do so. So there's just a couple of other examples up there. Imagine if Hemingway was a blogger or if JFK tweeted. A couple interesting questions I like to throw out are, what are our grandchildren going to know about us that we didn't know about our grandparents? One example of that is, I think most people are aware, the Library of Congress now archives all tweets, which means that if the Library of Congress is archiving it, it tends to stay archived. So our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will have the ability to look back at our tweet history, our tweet stream, to see what we were thinking and doing and tweeting about. All of this is to say big data is literally changing our values. And one of the things that we're still trying to do is to figure out how exactly. One of the arguments that I make in the book is, for example, there are a number of conflicting perspectives within the Fortune 50 on their data handling policies. As part of research for the book, we went through and actually read all of the data handling policy, public-facing data handling policies for all of the Fortune 50. And one of the interesting things that we found was 34 out of 50 of them explicitly said they would not sell personal data without consent. On the other hand, there was no policy that explicitly said that they would sell personal data. On the flip side of the coin, 11 out of the Fortune 50 stated that they would buy or obtain, in some fashion or other, data from third parties, but none of them said that they explicitly would not buy personal data. So the question that raises, I think, is if it's not okay to sell something, how is it okay to buy it? And the point there is just that there's still a lot of conflict over what's okay and what's not okay to do with personal data. Moving slides here. And so one of the interesting things about that, I think, from the ethical and legal perspective is, and Alistair pointed this out just a few minutes ago, the pace of technology innovation is much more rapid than the pace of legislation. And so there's a rising gap between what's possible technically and what's legal legally. Yeah. So the perspective I think that brings is two sort of overlapping realms. One is that it's never possible to act in compliance with a law that does not exist yet, but it's always possible to act in alignment with your values. And the risk there for organizations is that something that you might be doing today that might possibly be a little ethically borderline might actually be illegal tomorrow if it's the case that legislation catches up with, for example, what Alistair is pointing out as evolving community standards of decency. There is this question, however, of values. How do we understand our values? How do we articulate them? There are lots of different kinds of them. There are family values, there's value packs, there's value-added resellers. But what we're really talking about is the relationship between our individual values, that is to say our own moral code, and what we as a collective organization or as a community of standards of decency, as Alistair was describing, understand to be our shared values. But in order to understand that relationship, we first need to understand what our individual values are. And so, as an example, going back to the personal data handling matrix, there's just some examples of personal values that you might get started thinking about as we go through the rest of the talks today. And maybe even just jot down on a Post-it note or a 3x5 card or a whiteboard some things that you value as an individual, so that you can be thinking about how those might play into an actual conversation in your organization about shared values and the explicit conversation that you might want to have around your organization's data handling practices. The other thing that I'd like to mention around this notion of values and whether or not we're legally compliant or ethically aligned is that it's important to have a good perspective and a balanced point of view. There's a challenge because, for example, especially in big data ethics conversations, we often focus sometimes exclusively on privacy. And privacy is certainly a critical issue, but one of the arguments that I try to make is that it's not just about privacy. So focusing too narrowly on one individual aspect of big data ethics can cause us to have a constrained view that increases the amount of risk that we might face. On the flip side of things, we also benefit from tracking those larger cultural, legislative, political, social trends that are influencing what Alistair was calling common standards of decency. Those things influence what we think are ethical behaviors and actions. To put it differently, they help influence what we think is creepy or not creepy, and how we describe and talk about these things to each other. So relative to that perspective, there are, at least at this point, I think, 4 aspects of big data ethics. One is identity, which is the relationship between an individual's offline, real-world presence and their digital online identity. Another key aspect of data ethics is privacy, and I think we all have a general understanding of what that is. There's also a critical element of big data ethics around ownership. Who actually owns the data that you generate? There's a well-known phrase out there that says, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. And one of the challenges around that is the question of, if I generate information and data about me, then who's actually benefiting economically from the use of that data? And there's an interesting example around that. The Sierra Club actually has a lawsuit against Orange County in Southern California because Orange County was making government geographic information data available only for a very large fee and only to certain people. And the Sierra Club said, hey, that data was generated using federal tax dollars, therefore it should be available to everyone. And they actually had to take them to court to settle the ownership question around that. Another aspect of data ethics is reputation, which is the impact on individuals and organizations of judgments based on what is necessarily an incomplete or inaccurate data set about you. So here are some of the challenges, I think, that we're all aware of that create barriers and constraints around having productive ethical conversations in organizational contexts. One is that our existing obligations are not going to disappear. We have jobs to do. We have lives to live. The world is going to continue to turn. And what we're asking really is for people to engage in yet another and difficult and nuanced and sort of slippery conversation. We're unclear about where legislation is going to go. Legislators often are not the most technically savvy folks on the planet, and a lot of times the complexities of the innovations that are available and the benefits that big data can bring us can inadvertently, in many cases, be constrained by legislation. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, and taking that balanced perspective and looking through the telescope down the road is an important way to mitigate that risk. Ethics is hard. We're talking about very personal and deeply held things like what we value. There's a link up on the site. I'm not sure if you can see it or if it's live, but there's a post I recently wrote out there about why data ethics is hard. One of the issues is people feel like when you talk about ethics, there's a risk of being judged, and people don't like to be judged. So that's just one element of what makes ethics a very hard thing. We're steering a big ship. Organizational politics are complicated. There are uncertain rocks in the landscape, in the sea, around legislation. We're challenged by not knowing what other people think and lacking that common vocabulary and framework for talking about it. It's difficult even to just kickstart the conversation. So one of the things is that lack of a common vocabulary itself creates a constraint to having those productive discussions. But it's valuable to at least start the conversation because there are a lot of innovation values that can be generated from big data. And what we want to do is minimize the risk and understand that big data itself is ethically neutral. It's the use of that data that is potentially not. And there are enormous potential benefits. And the challenge there is to reduce the risk of those unintended consequences from not consciously and explicitly and transparently having those conversations in the organizational environments. So how can we bridge those gaps and reduce the risk of unintended consequences and improve the benefits from innovation? The very first place to start is to know your values, to be willing to have those conversations, to understand and, again, to be explicit and transparent yourself, and to bring those into conversations in your organization. The second thing is you need to align your actions with those values. Are we doing things in our daily lives, in our work, that align with the things that we believe and that we want to promote in our communities? We want to educate and inform both ourselves and others. We need to be very explicit about that. Instead of having the it's creepy, no it's not conversation, we need to say, hey, do we believe this, and is this the thing that we want to believe, and is that represented by the practices that we have in our data handling? Expect it to be challenging. It's not going to be always an easy conversation. There are going to be disagreements that might be uncomfortable at times. But again, one of the benefits and the outcomes of those conversations eventually is that we get to benefit from the innovation that it brings, and we get to reduce the risks from unintended consequences. Some of the clear benefits that we're already aware of closing those gaps and building those bridges is faster adoption by consumers. There are a number of examples of organizations out there that are very clear about their values and communicate them openly and explicitly to their customers, and they have huge brand loyalty. Patagonia is an example, the Newman's Own brand, Ben & Jerry's. There's a number of examples out there that are very clearly well aligned with their customer base, and that so when they bring out new products and services, there's generally not much of a question with their market about whether they're going to be interested in it, because they already have a trusting, long-standing, and value-aware relationship with those organizations. Internally, aligning your values with your actions can increase the pace of innovation. One of the turns of phrase there is, it turns the question from should we do this into how can we do this? Because if we already know that we're aligned with our values and we have a common and shared set of them, and we know what they are, then we already know that we're pretty sure that we're going to be more or less aligned on what we can do and what we can't do. So the question becomes less about whether we should be doing it and more about how we actually can do it. And one of the outcomes there is that can increase the pace of innovation inside your organization around developing new products and services. It reduces the risk from unintended consequences. Again, I think the best example there is probably the risk from unknown or emerging legislation. So one of the challenges is we don't know what laws are going to be coming down the road, but we have an opportunity to influence them, and we have an opportunity to understand them if we are looking at it from the right perspective. And then the last thing, and I'll just, there's kind of a long quote on the slide there, but the Boston Consulting Group recently came out with a little video that I think just states it very well. It says that as the volume and value of consumer data continues to grow, trust will become an increasingly potent competitive weapon, and organizations that carefully steward its use of consumer data will find that people are more willing to allow it access and use of that data. So I think that that's a very clear trend, and I think that's a very concise expression of it. And I want to emphasize, there's just a couple more slides here, and then I'll close up. It's very rarely an either-or proposition. Most things exist on a scale. Again, ethics is a very abstract subject. It has very real-world consequences. But part of the conceptual nature of things like values and community standards and decency are that they're relative. And understanding where they fall on that positive, negative, Skynet to singularity scale is often a really, really good place to start. So lastly, I'd just like to sum up a little bit. This is all about exploring. It's about exploring the gap between our values and our actions. It's about exploring what a balanced perspective might look like. And it's about understanding that it's not just about privacy. It's about all sorts of things. One clear technical example, for example, is that an organization's privacy policy is inherently determined by how its information systems define your identity within your account. So how you design a database architecture has everything to do with what you can or can't do relative to your privacy policy. So it's important to understand that those aspects are linked and their relationships are still being discovered and evolving. Closing the gap between your values and your actions is challenging, but there are clear rewards. And the last thing, just to sum up, big data is increasing our responsibility, I think, to engage in explicit ethical discussion, to protect and inform employees, customers, and partners, and to learn to navigate this increasingly complex data handling ecosystem. And that's my last slide, so I'll turn it back over to Alistair at this point.
Thanks, Cord. That was a lot to chew on, and I think the audience feels the same way. You got a whole bunch of questions here, so let's try and go through some of them. You mentioned, and I think you sort of addressed this one, that the law tends to provide rules after technology makes something possible or probable. How do we get legislators to think further ahead of the curve, further than a 4-year electoral cycle at the very least, but further ahead of the curve about the possibilities of these technologies, since we don't know what the consequences are going to be?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I usually have this on the tip of my tongue when I don't right this second. I'll look at it. There's an organization out there whose name, again, is going to slip my mind, but it's an organization of technologists it's a nonprofit, and their entire mission and goal is to inform legislators about technology. So these are folks that have deep technical backgrounds and expertise, and they want to do exactly that. They want to make sure that the legislation that we propose continues to honor our ability to innovate and doesn't sort of in an unintended or unnecessary way hobble our ability to do that. And as we're talking, I'll look that name up and I'll find it.
Sure. Thanks. So I guess John is talking about the stuff I discussed, but you can comment on it. Given the wide range of values, those often strident moral minorities, I used an example of someone who likes pasta a little too much because it seemed neutral, but you could certainly take a different end of the spectrum. If you look at Jonathan Haidt's sort of ranking of conservatives and liberals, you could take two, gun control on the one side and then homosexuality on the other, for example, right? Those two tend not to be strongly correlated or inversely correlated. How do we go about finding an ethical balance? I mean, it seems like there's no middle ground. The political parties, the Pew studies show that we have never been as divided as we are today along political lines. In fact, there was a recent article about by the Pew Research Organization about how we are more polarized along political party lines than we are by gender, income, race, or religion. And that seems just astonishing to me. We disagree more with people if on the opposite party than we do with people of different races, religions, genders, income levels. How do we make the world recognize that everybody else is weird, right? And that the Internet making us weird at scale is just a consequence of this technology?
Yep, I think that's a fascinating question, and I'm also fascinated you referenced Jonathan Haidt. I think his work is deeply insightful, and I'm still in the process of trying to understand it. So I'm going to have an answer that disappoints me probably as much as everybody else, which is at this point, the only thing that I can think of is to encourage more explicit discussion. I think that we need to come to those discussions with an open mind. I think it's a lot to ask. I understand it's a huge challenge. I understand that there are existing preferences and sort of divisive positions that people have, And the only thing that I can think of at this point is to just encourage people to be more explicit in talking about it.
Sure, okay. A couple more questions here. Who owns data from the Internet of Things, the maker or the person who bought the gadget, especially things like health gadgets?
Yeah, also a great question. There's a growing concept out there that I think is worth considering, which is it's less about the person that created it or about the person who's storing it, but more about how it's captured. And I think what's interesting about that is that kind of removes the onus from very generic information like, for example, I'm exactly 6 feet tall, and that information doesn't really have any value unless it's correlated or aggregated with other information. But the means of capture, which, for example, is what many targeted advertising platforms utilize technology like that, I think is an interesting concept. So that's all I'll say about that one.
Okay, let's take a couple more, and then I want to make sure we move on so that Orly and Amanda have a chance to grind through this. How does a company build trust with regards to customer data collection? You talked about trust being a competitive advantage. So how does a company build trust? What kinds of things can they do for that? Is it just transparency, or is there more than that?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, it's transparency and also being explicit. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. I think there are a lot, in many organizations, there are a lot of change issues, transformation, and even pretty held cultural constraints around actually being transparent and building trusting relationships. There's a great example in the Pacific Northwest. There's a regional bank called Umpqua Bank, and Umpqua has a very friendly, consumer-friendly brand. They play popular music in their branches, and they have cookies, and they're very open, and that's sort of the way they go to market. And one of the things I've seen that they do that is just amazing to me is if you're an Umpqua Bank customer, they will send you an actual one-page description of their data handling policy in very human language, in their friendly brand tone, that says, here's what we do with it, here's how long we keep it, we won't sell it or we will sell it. They're just very clear in very human language about that. I think that's one great example of what an organization could do to start building trust with their customer base, which is to say, hey, you got questions, we got answers. You want to know what we do with your data, here's what we do with it. And to the degree that an organization is comfortable with that, then I think they're going to be even more successful starting to build a trusting relationship with their customer base.
All right, good. Lots of other questions on the thread here. I'll let you answer some of them maybe in the chat room or online, and we'll probably come back to some of them as we pick up our next speaker. So, Aurélie, very nice for you to join us all the way from Europe, and I'm looking forward to hearing about privacy by design.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Cord, as well. Thank you for having me and for the time as well. I'm actually the only European in this bunch, and happy to be here as well. I have a different background. My background is related to analytics, mainly what was called web analytics, now digital analytics. And I have a very, very European heart, so please bear with me when I talk about the link between analytics and legislation. I have now founded a company now in Spain called Mind Your Group and also Mind Your Privacy, where basically we bridge the gap between analytics and the challenges related to privacy coming from the legal side of things. I want to start off with maybe some expectations. Again, to warn you, I'm European, so I have a very specific view upon the challenges related to privacy and data protection. But I'm not going to talk about legislation, so I hope this comes as a good news. I would like to compare different countries, however, to show some differences between how we talk about data protection and privacy between different continents. And maybe compare it to other evolutions within our society, such as road traffic. talk also about tech companies, what the big difference is between today and how things have evolved in the past, and maybe show some differences between the two worlds where I live in, analytics and then legislation, to come to indeed some kind of consensus. And as Cord said as well, I think the most important part of all this is to have discussions with open minds and bring people together. In the end, I would also finish by talking about big data and answering the question whether privacy or the privacy framework might be dead due to big data. I think not, but I think it does mean that we need to rethink a lot of things, and finishing by the idea whether legal is always a good idea. So as I said, for me, data protection is something very important. I grew up bilingual in Europe. I have worked on different analytics projects in the past, and the idea is really that I want to bridge the gap between analytics and privacy. In comparison with the United States, what we have related to privacy is that in Europe we have privacy is enshrined into our legislation as being a fundamental right. You don't have to agree with that, and that's totally fine with me, but for us it's basically something very, very important. Another thing that might be interesting as well is that Spain is the country where I live today, is actually responsible for about 80% of the EU data protection fines. Most people usually talk about Germany. But actually in Spain, while we have a lot of problems with crisis and debt and things like that, we actually make money with data protection. So that's an interesting sidestep to this. We also have strict data protection legislation, breach notifications. When we talk about legislation, you might have noticed that a lot more countries are actually adopting breach notifications. Because when we're talking about more and more data that we're collecting, it's about security as well, making sure that this data is not leaked outside and used for different purposes that could be actually bad. Other thing that's very specific about Spain is that we have security protocols that are enshrined into the data protection legislation that's been active for the last 12 years now. So in this gap bridging that we do between analytics and data protection, basically what we also do is we start talking about best practices related to security, because most breaches that occur are actually due to human error. So you can put security on top of your data stack as much as you want, but if your people are not sufficiently trained, you still have problems with security. So Spain is an interesting angle within Europe when it comes to privacy, and this is something we shouldn't forget. Currently, I'm currently in Germany, and it was interesting to see the first front page of the Spiegel that came out today, where basically the Spiegel is wondering whether we shouldn't give political asylum to Edward Snowden, which is an interesting thing and something that I've seen evolve also through time in the last 10 days or something like that. Suddenly we're talking about the rule of law and privacy in light of democracy. This is just to show you where basically Europe is going. Everybody's talking, of course, about PRISM and NSA and things like that. Angela Merkel's phone being hacked and things like that. But we're really worried about the fact that, well, maybe this is not only about data being leaked and wrongful legislation, but this might be about actually saving democracy one way or another as well. And I wanted to quote somebody who's a woman that I admire a lot, the president of Kosovo, who mentioned that democracy must be built on open societies that share information. And she also mentioned the rule of law. When there's no sharing of power, no rule of law, no accountability, there is abuse, corruption, and anything is possible. And I wanted to use this to introduce this notion of the rule of law and also compare how our different societies are actually built around the rule of law and which differences we have between how legislation is set up between the United States and more Anglo-Saxon countries and European countries. Because essentially, while we, for example, both talk about privacy, we don't use the same words. In the United States, we talk a lot about privacy. In the EU, we prefer to talk about personal data protection. So this is one of the big differences is that we tend to focus a lot on the citizens, and this idea, we talked earlier about the ownership of the data, and I think in Europe in general, maybe the UK is totally different. Richard, I suppose you'll want to discuss that as well. Data belongs to the visitor or the prospect or the consumer or the citizen. When I talk about this to my fellow colleagues in the analytics world, 10 years ago, they would tell me privacy is dead, and now we're kind of, getting somewhere because we've been talking about it and things like that. But when it comes to data ownership, for them in the United States, it's always clear that the data belongs to whoever is collecting it, or it's related to how it's being stored and things like that. Other things that are important to note as well is that the rule of law in the United States and the UK is based on common law practices, whereas in Europe we talk about continental law, which means that when we're talking about risks of being fined, for example, in Europe it's usually quite ridiculous. That the number of fines are going up, the amount also of fines are going up. Again, Spain is one of those champions in terms of fines, but the United States would look more at the notion of class actions, for example. And then when you really look at the different legislations, well, basically legislation in common law countries such as the United States are really based on sector legislation, so you have different sectors overlapping between health and finances, and then also the Video Privacy Protection Act, which is a really funny example court mentions as well. While in Europe, we're striving to have overarching regulations, such as the one that's currently being prepared, the European Personal Data Protection Regulation, that should be discussed in Parliament in the spring of next year to hopefully get enforced by 2016. So another distinction which is interesting as well is that we talk a lot about PII, and a lot of privacy policies also mention the use of PII, or they don't use PII, and a lot of analytics tools also use this kind of information. And it's interesting to note that actually PII varies per state in the United States, but they have defined lists. So in certain states, a social security number will be PII. In other states, it will not be the case. So I think when we point out to Europe being like a mismatch of different countries and different legislations, and saying, oh, it's really difficult to know what to do when it comes to data protection in Europe, I think the United States has similar problems, because when we work for certain clients, the first question is always, okay, in which state are you based, and which state are we talking about, to actually see with the legislation of this state if this is PII or it's not. I think, to be honest, Europe has always avoided to talk about a very clear list of PII. They don't really like to pin it down exactly. But the new regulation that's coming up is starting to talk about anonymized data, pseudo-anonymized data. So this is a lot on our minds today as well. Now, this is a list that I set up. I'm open to discussion, and so there's a little asterisk to say you don't have to agree. What's interesting as well is that we're always talking about EU versus US, and nobody seems to actually listening to the fact that, well, Asia is moving quite well in terms of data protection as well, and they're highly influenced by what Europe is doing. So I don't think it's a EU versus US discussion. It should be actually a global discussion. And whatever happens, it's clear that privacy is a tough cookie to crack. Cord mentioned earlier that it was clearly defined. For me, privacy is not clearly defined. It has a lot of different ramifications, a lot of discussions, and certainly when we talk to our clients, we can talk about analytics as well as bring your own device issues, as well as employee training, and then it moves to security and things like that. So on the other hand, if I think about the differences between the United States and Europe, I truly believe this is a global problem and that should be solved on a global level, a bit in the idea of Declaration of Human Rights that was said as well. And to be honest, this is kind of my wish or my dream for the next 10 years, hopefully through discussions. And when I look at things like the OECD releasing their privacy guidelines after 23 years once again, I can imagine that, well, it's about a global discussion. It's not just about Europe versus the United States. Which brings me back to this idea, technology and legislation. Legislation always has a problem keeping up with technology. And Europe came out with this really weird thing called the Cookie Directive a couple of years back, and you might hate it and you might like it. And the thing is, what I think about it is it was very technologically specific, which I don't think is a good idea when it comes to legislation, because by default it lags behind. So I hope that the upcoming legislation will be not so technology specific. Also, mainly due to the fact that, well, basically, cookies are evolving. We're talking about digital fingerprinting. We're talking about new ways of identifying individuals and things like that. So I think that was not such a great idea from the European Union. One could maybe suggest that it had the advantage of raising the awareness even before we started talking about all the issues that we know today related to the NSA. So let's give the European Union some points for raising some kind of awareness. I think this takes time, and what I really wanted to bring as the first takeaway is that we have different points of view when it comes to privacy and data protection, and that's absolutely okay. And I don't think that we're going to crack the nut or crack the cookie through a single discussion. I think it's going to take a lot of time. What we also tend to do is that we compare the evolution of legislation for data protection to how road trafficking has been legislated through time. If you look, for example, at Times Square in New York for 100 years ago and what it is today, well, it took time to think about, are we going to build a zebra paths to cross, the road signs and things like that. They were built slowly but surely. It's not as if they appeared from one day to the other. And even today, when you think about traffic and these lights, when you look at the French, even they still have very different ways of crossing paths. Instead of, well, in Belgium we call it zebra paths. In France they're called passage clouté. So it's a matter of time. Things evolve slowly but surely, and it's clear that technology evolves faster than legislation. But what this also means in terms of time, well, we had 100 years to adapt traffic legislation for the roads. It means that today suddenly companies need to build a privacy culture internally, and that usually privacy procedures are really new to technological players. Talking again about the NSA thing and PRISM, when we talk about ISPs or telcos sharing information with security agencies in different countries, This is nothing new. This has been happening for the last 15 years. But we all know that within ISPs, well, there's this little pool of people who have been doing that for many years, have specific protocols in place, know how this works, have a privacy culture. The big difference with technological companies, like, for example, the Facebooks or the Google, is that in a couple of years' time, they had to catch up really, really fast with that. So I'm not sure that these companies have technological cultures. And you're faced with a technical guy that has the capability of doing a lot of very interesting things, but indeed somebody has to put barriers and say, well, is this actually a good idea? And when we talk about ethics, it's possible also that through evolution of mentality, what is considered to be a bad idea today might actually be something interested or accepted in the next couple of years. So it's also about when am I going to launch something new based on my data, and maybe I want to hold on to this idea, do some education with my clients before that, and then launch it at some other time. So timing is really of essence here, because we need all these actors to move in the same way. Another difference that I wanted to highlight, and it's a huge problem for the legislator, is this idea that data is transferable ad infinitum. So without decay, you just can resell and resell and resell, which has never been the case with other kinds of goods before. These create new privacy challenges in the sense that even the French DPA is starting to talk about things like la bande de GAFA, which is an allegory to compare them to the Gaza Strip when they're talking about Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, considering that, well, the data is owned by the users and should not be eternally transferable in order to make money. It's a very, very specific French opinion about this, and the French are really worried about different things such as exclusion from communities due to big data and things like that. So it's important to understand that Europe has very specific views upon it and very specific worries related to data protection. But when it boils down to it, the question we often get here in Europe is, shouldn't we have the businesses take care of itself? Shouldn't there be some kind of self-regulation compared to legislation? Usually it's this kind of fight that we see. It's like Europe wants legislation and the United States wants self-regulation. We've seen different things going on with the DNT, for example, the Do Not Track initiatives. And personally, I think this entire problem is a triangle. We're talking about the government, we're talking about the businesses, and we're talking about basically the citizens or the consumers or the voters. And we all have a part to play in this in order to find a consensus of way of living and a way of working that balances between data protection, the rule of law, and the respect of fundamental rights versus the profits and hopefully sustainability for the companies to view this on the long term. And this triangle, you can put it, I put governments on top, but it doesn't need to be. You could put citizens on top or businesses on top. I don't really care, but it's important to understand that all three of us need to do things related to this. We need to be more educated, we need to have legislation, and we need to have best practices coming from the businesses as well. My line of work, I don't lobby. I really avoid doing that, even though I have this personal, strong European view upon data protection. But I really focus on businesses and consumers, and in order to see what they can do related to data protection. And it's really, when you think about it, it's really a matter of trust. It's a matter of, I give you my data and I imagine you're going to use it in the best way possible. If not, well, I'll imagine other ways of using maybe other services, and my switching costs are not too big. So that's always the big discussion. And when, for example, we look at Facebook, how the privacy policies have evolved, what you suddenly notice is that basically Facebook is sharing more and more data. It's really difficult to keep up with the privacy policies. I know last time I went through, I think I cleaned it every 3 months, something like that, just to make sure that, the data is not too open and things like that. But I'm not sure that opening up slowly but surely the data to more and more users in the field is actually something that creates trust. And this is also something that comes back when we take a look at surveys and things like that, is that trust is very relative depending on which company we're talking about. And clearly Facebook is the one that, well, everybody has a problem with. I wanted to compare also the different sectors in which I've been working. So on the left-hand side, what you see here is the definition of what a data life cycle is for an analyst. So basically this idea that, well, you collect data, you tune it, you do something with it, you crunch it, and you use it. So these steps can vary depending on the problem that we have, but basically it's that. You get the data, you use the data. If you compare this to the right-hand side of this slide, when legal people talk about the data life cycle, they talk about the creation of the data and most of all, so the definition of purpose. Why are you collecting this data? You're using this data, and at some point you're also going to destroy this data. And it's interesting to see that basically the same two words, data life cycle, in one sector or another have overlapping meanings, but do miss certain steps or certain points within this life cycle. Last time at a conference, I asked how many analysts actually think about destroying the data or data cleansing or things like that. It's very, very rare. People don't really do that. And when I look at privacy policies for LinkedIn, for example, the idea in their privacy policies is that they can keep my data forever. There's no notion of destruction at some point. And I can't help but also wonder, is it really that interesting to have my data from 10 years ago? Is there really a value in that? Or can we also imagine that, well, I actually use my data for one thing and then destroy it at some point? So it's important to get these two worlds talking to one another, because if you want legislation to understand analytics and vice versa, well, clearly there are certain bridges that actually don't exist, or certain steps that don't exist in the mind of the analyst. And I'm sure also certain issues that analysts face that the people from the law do not understand either. So it's important to get these people together. Another example of this is that, well, this comes from MIT. This is about how to do a project in one of the research departments. And again, it's talking about reuse of data, but it doesn't ever talk about the destruction of the data or disappearance of the data. So data is infinitely transferable. In terms of legislation, well, we are more and more worried about leaking data. That's also why we want to point towards this idea of destruction. And leaking data can cause harm, so more and more countries are talking about breach notifications as well. And we should actually start thinking about working together in order to come to procedures and processes that would work for both parties. And what's interesting as well is that the legal guys are actually pretty good at writing procedures. I mean, I spent a lot of time reading them. Last week it was security procedures for the Bank of Tokyo. To be honest, I fall asleep every time, so, I need a lot of energy to read them. But they are there, they exist. And as in the time of analytics, where we had a lot of problems having people accept the data and actually do something with the data, we find now that companies are evolving towards wanting to educate their business users about the use of data. They want to go towards more data-driven decision-making. I would argue that it would be a good idea also to educate people about privacy and data protection and have these discussions that Court talked about in terms of ethics and see what we consider to be creepy or not and things like that. I wanted to integrate some very basic privacy terms as well that we really love here in Europe. And you'll hear them over and over again. There have been discussions that are also ad infinitum about it. So the legal guys want to know why you're going to collect the data. They always want a purpose. They always want you to define why you're going to collect the data. And they also want to make sure that you'll get consent through opt-in or opt-out or whatever. But it actually links to the idea that the way you're going to use the data should be within the line of what the visitor, the consumer expects reasonably. So the other day, the image that you see here is data we got from Google and using an Android phone lately while checking in different things. And we were pretty surprised, to see all this data in here. My team we're analysts and we're lawyers and we're a mix of different people. And we could imagine the technology made this available, but we did not imagine all this tracking. So our expectations, and I'm sure that the normal person in the street who is using, different tools and their phones and things like that, is not imagining all the data that's being collected about them. So if you're not being transparent or your use of your collection of data is actually beyond the expectation of the normal citizen, I think there's already a breach of trust and a problem of defining whether this is creepy or not and things like that. So it's an interesting vision of what all the data can do, but I'm not sure that the average human being in the street can actually understand what we all can do with technology today. The question we get a lot is, did big data then kill the privacy framework? And it's a very, very American question. It's, we don't know what we're going to find with big data. So, we can't define a purpose. So basically, forget about privacy, it's dead. We would like to argue that, well, actually not. It's changing. You need to find new ways of working, because basically what you're going to do is you're going to collect data, analyze it, find a new purpose for this data, and you'll have to define whether, well, you can actually use this data in the light that you've collected in the first place, or you need to go back to the consumer to ask for their consent in order to make sure that you can, go on with the ideas. Or then to say, well, maybe not today, we'll maybe keep this in the fridge for the next 6 months. Do some communication about it, see what people feel, and define whether it's creepy or not, and then move on to implement it or not. But the problem is implementing new things because you found new conclusions through the analysis of big data without really thinking about it can actually cause quite some backlash. And this is the typical examples of Target, the supermarkets who went after pregnant young girls, and they had a negative backlash around this. For us also, we talk a lot about privacy and security and the overlap of privacy and security. What we feel is that basically most of security breaches are due to human error. So basically, it's about educating your people. It's about putting processes in place, and it's about making sure that people know what they're allowed to do on top of your data collection. And then you put the security on top of this. And in the middle, you've got this guy that is going to define whether yes or no the way you're using data and the new ways you're finding through big data to use your data is something that is acceptable or not. So taking the first slide and the second slide together, basically what we see is that we can define processes inside companies in order to see if yes or no you're going to use this data in the new ways that you found. But somebody has to be there in the middle to say, yes, go ahead, or no, don't go ahead. And this is also something that the European Personal Data Protection Regulation wants to put in place. They want to put in place like this traffic person in the middle called the Data Protection Officer, that will actually help the company define how they're going to structure all this data collection, all this analysis, and how they're going to structure the way that they're going to work in order to make sure that there's no specific backlash coming from the consumer who are going to complain about how their data is being used. Basically, also, we see the security as icing on the cake. If you don't have the pillars related to the process and the human resources, the best technology in the world will not help you assure that your data is secure, as most breaches are due to human error. So it's something very important also to assure that, well, you actually train your people and make sure that they understand what data protection is, privacy is, and also then discuss the ethics of these different boundaries, not only in the light of the legal boundaries, but also in the light of, well, are consumers going to find this weird or creepy, or is this totally acceptable? In order to finish, this is something that came also from the IAPP at the security conference in Amsterdam about a week ago, and where basically they said that when we're talking about privacy management, the first thing we usually do is that we define risk. What is the risk of doing this or the risk of doing that? It's always a risk-driven approach, but it should be the one more important in terms of defining what we're going to do. You need to prepare clearly in terms of evolution for the changes that are going to come, and also certainly recognize that it's not because it's legal that it's a good idea. As I said, there's certain stuff that you could better put in the fridge for now, do some communication about it, and then maybe put it out some months later. Consider how privacy could be USP. We're working with a couple of clients about that. And it's most of all about finding a common language. Get these people, these lawyers, together with the analytics guys. Talk about, is this a good idea? Put marketing inside there as well. And, the legal guys are going to say, okay, is there a risk of us being fined? Yes or no? Okay, we have a probability here, and then see, well, is it worth for us to go ahead, or do we consider that it might be too creepy for our clients? The idea is to build a privacy culture inside your company, and this is going to take time, clearly, and the way we see privacy is very different from one continent to another, but we really need to sit together and have these discussions with open minds. And that's about it.
All right, awesome, Arlie. And thank you both Cord and Arlie for adding some content as opposed to the fluff I started with. There's a lot of good hard data on here. Arlie, you're going into more detail about this next week at Strata in London, is that correct?
Yep,
cool.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that.
Excellent. So I'm going to, we're a little behind on time, so I'm going to keep this to one question, but you have a bunch of questions on here. I'm going to ask the question from, I don't know if it's Jean or Jean Dion. But corporations or countries might have policies, but who audits them to make sure they're following them and are legal, where and how it is used or stored? Is there any sort of UN or oversight agency that's being planned?
It's a good question. So basically per country there are data protection agencies, and I'm quite worried about the fact that each DPA works a bit separately. So the Spanish one, for example, as I said, is responsible for 80% of data protection fines. So just from a financial perspective, they work really differently. And it's clear that, for example, the Irish have different views than the French when it comes to data protection. So we're currently analyzing all the different DPAs. for Europe at least, and there is a body on top of that called the Working Party 29, which gives directions as well. But I think it would be time for Europe to make, a global one for Europe at least. There's no UN-like agency plans, but I know there was yesterday related to the GCHQ issues that were reported. I know that Privacy Matters filed with the OECD a complaint related to that, to infringements of rights. It will be interesting to see how this actually plays out. But for the moment, not really, no.
Okay, cool.
Unfortunately.
All right, next speaker. So Amanda, I have asked to talk to us about a slightly unrelated, but I think far more troubling issue than we've covered so far. We generate a lot of data, but that data is usually generated outside ourselves. And increasingly science, whether through biometrics or FMRI or other technologies, there are ways to find out what's going on inside someone's head, and this kind of stuff generates a ton of data. There's a lot of data in neuroscience, and Amanda is uniquely qualified to speak about the intersection of law, ethics, and neuroscience. So without stealing her thunder, I'm going to let her explain the topic at hand. It's a pretty interesting and provocative one. So over to you, Amanda.
Thanks very much, Alistair. I've already learned so much from the two other presenters. As you've mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on one specific slice of the kind of data that we might be concerned about as we think about big data and data mining more generally. So I would call the era that we are entering the brain new world. There are multiple technologies that can image the brain and the brain's processes that have only been developed just in the last couple of decades and that are producing more and more refined information about the brain and its functions every day. As this information gets more refined and more specific, we're moving from brain reading to something that looks a little bit more like mind reading. In other words, moving from being able to tell if somebody has something like a tumor to being able to tell aspects of what he or she might be thinking, and then perhaps even more troublingly, although it could also be useful, so it has a positive aspect, not only what a person might be thinking, but how he or she might think. What kind of a thinker is this person? And drawing distinctions between different types of people and their risk profiles and their preferences based on what we learn about their brains. So I'm going to give us a quick overview of some of these technologies. I've listed functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, structural imaging, and EEG, but I'm going to focus on two of them that are the most relevant for these purposes, fMRI and EEG. So what is fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging? fMRI takes first a static structural picture of the brain, and then it tracks how the blood flow changes within the brain as the person in the scanner responds to a particular task. It could be a physical task. I might ask Alistair to press a button. It could be a cognitive task. I could ask Aurélie to recall a happy memory or a sad memory. And the magnetic fields that are created by the change in blood flow as different parts of the brain become active during those tasks create magnetic signatures. Those magnetic signatures can be detected by the MRI machine as a change over time in where oxygenated blood is moving in the brain. That gives us a picture represented, as you can see on this slide, in false color. That's the technical term. It's not me insulting the colors. It's called false color because your brain is not actually lighting up red, orange, yellow, blue. That creates a map of which regions of the brain are most active as a person performs different physical or cognitive tasks. This allows us not only to see how the average or typical brain functions, it allows us to see how different brains function, how a person with autism or psychopathic personality disorder or other kinds of impairments accomplish these tasks differently from the person with the typical brain. So fMRI allows us to see the brain at work while we think, feel, speak, and do. And this now allows us to make certain inferences that can be potentially diagnostic and potentially predictive, which can raise issues about data use and data privacy. I'll just give you two examples. The examples of people with psychopathic personality disorder and the example of people who have been convicted of child sexual abuse and who self-describe as pedophiles. In an emotional task, where you put a person in a scanner and ask him or her to respond to disturbing pictures or to think about an incident that was loving or troubling or frightening in their life. People with typical personality show significant activity in regions of the brain involved in emotional processing, generally called the limbic system, and particularly a specific region of the brain called the amygdala. People with psychopathic personality who score very high on certain psychometric tests for being callous, for using others as tools, for feeling no remorse when they exploit other people, who may have committed violent crimes. These emotional centers in the brain show significantly less activity on fMRI screening. And for those of you who are science fiction fans or movie buffs, or may, and I'm showing my hand here, may just have good taste in movies, this might remind you of the pupil dilation test in Blade Runner, where, excuse me, normal humans, non-replicants, showed greater pupil dilation in response to emotional cues, whereas replicants showed a more muted pupil dilation response. This is very similar to the Blade Runner test, except it's using brain activity signatures to distinguish typical people from people with psychopathic tendencies. Another way in which fMRI has been used, interestingly, is in scanning the brains of people convicted of child sex offenses. Unsurprisingly, when you show typical subject participant sexualized images of children, their brains do not reflect a signature indicative of sexual arousal. And when you show convicted child sex offenders the same images, their brains do show activity patterns indicative of sexual arousal. So this, we may not be able to draw the big inference that a person is a pedophile because their brain makes them that. I'm not talking about causation here, but as a matter of correlation, and correlation can then be valid simply for predictive purposes, it appears that people's brains reasonably accurately reflect through certain signatures what that person finds arousing. So if we took Alistair's Spaghetti Man from the opening vignette of the conference and we put him in an fMRI machine and we showed him typical fetish objects like shoes, he might show no arousal, but you show him spaghetti and boom, the lights go off everywhere. These are potential use cases for fMRI that are already being used in the lab, and we can imagine that there would be interest in using this technology in law enforcement and in employment, and I'll talk about that later because in some ways that's starting to become reduced into practice. The next technology that's highly relevant that we should focus on is EEG, electroencephalography. This is a much older technology that uses the electrical signatures of brainwaves that we all emanate unconsciously and outside of our control all of the time to provide information about what's happening inside the brain. This has been used medically for decades. If a person is suspected of having epilepsy or certain kinds of sleep disorders, EEG can be used diagnostically. EEG also has some interesting potential uses in determining if a person is lying or telling the truth, if a person has seen particular stimuli before or has particular knowledge or familiarity with the subject. Researchers in this area who are enthusiastic about the use of EEG claim that the brain produces a characteristic recognition wave called the P300 wave, because the wave occurs 300 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus, that indicates whether or not a person is familiar with the stimulus. So let me give you an example to show why that might be relevant. Let's say we're doing a criminal investigation and the victim was killed with a particular handgun. We have a suspect. We want to know if she has ever seen this handgun before. And rather than asking her, have you ever seen this gun, or is this your gun, questions to which she could easily fabricate an answer, we could, these researchers claim, show the person the gun itself or a picture of the gun, and if she recognizes the gun, she will show a higher P300 response detectable by EEG than if she had not seen the gun. So EEG is being developed by researchers into protocols that researchers hope will be useful for lie detection in a much more accurate way and a much less falsifiable way than the traditional polygraph. And DARPA has also been interested in developing these technologies. Some of them have failed, but there is an ongoing call for the development of further EEG technologies that can be used in the field for lie detection and familiarity detection and suspect screening. So quickly, what are some of the contexts of neurological data collection, either by fMRI or EEG, or some of the other technologies that we're not going to discuss today because they're secondary in importance? There are 6 data collection contexts that I'll touch upon relatively briefly. The first is basic research. The second is law enforcement investigations. The third is in the courtroom, where neuroscientific data about the suspect, the victim, or the plaintiff could be offered either by the party or against the party in either a civil or a criminal matter. In the context of parole determinations, there's some very interesting new research that may wind up influencing who is granted parole versus who is retained in prison for the full term of incarceration. Education and healthcare are possible contexts. I'm not going to talk about those today. And in employment screening, there are several commercial companies that are attempting to use these neuroscientific technologies and sell them to companies to use to screen their future employees or their current employees. Now, basic research is the first context in which we might have concerns about the collection, use, and safety of neuroscientific information. So all of these wonderful fMRI studies that are starting to tell us basic information about how the brain works and provide us with cognitive maps of which parts of the brain are involved in which mental tasks and which physical actions produce an enormous amount of data. Multiple images are taken of each subject. They may be taken over time. Biographical information is collected from each subject so that active subjects can be matched with controls. And that's standard research protocol, not just for neuroscientific studies, but for any biomedical study. This data is then de-identified so that the subject is known by a number and not known by her name or his name. However, recently we've learned, and it's been the subject of an O'Reilly Strata talk as well, that de-identification is really easy, or, well, I couldn't do it myself, but for people who know how to do these kinds of things, it's not as challenging as we might have hoped. De-identification can relatively easily lead to re-identification, where just a couple of pieces of biographical data can de-anonymize a subject who has been ascribed a number instead of a name. And indeed, there have been re-identification attacks, a kind of hacking into a system, where de-identified users or subjects are easily re-identified, and then that information, if it's re-identified by people who are malicious, could be published and could be broadly disseminated. The less malicious use case is that this data is sold to data brokers or to health insurance companies, and that's not intended to be malicious. It's a commercial use, but the effects could be just as far-reaching if you or I participates in an fMRI study that shows that, whoops, we look like we have psychopathic personality, or more commonly, we're subject to depression. might our health insurance company, using re-identified data, be able to charge us higher rates or decide that we're not as good of a risk? Might an employer make an adverse employment determination based on obtaining re-identified brain scan data from somebody who simply went in to participate as a research subject? So medical data that's produced by research, medical research, needs to be guarded in any event. Neuroscientific information is just a special use case of that, but one that we might have particular concerns about because of the relationship between brain and mind and the very negative inferences that might be drawn if there are any negative findings about your brain. The other issue with neuroscientific data and basic research is the somewhat less troubling question of incidental findings. You go in for a brain scan. It's not as uncommon as one might think that the researchers incidentally find out other things about your brain. You have a small tumor. You have a weak blood vessel that could give rise to an aneurysm. You have some little spots that represent infarcts, that is, small strokes. Do the researchers have an ethical obligation to disclose to you the incidental findings that they have learned about your brain that you would otherwise never have known about? The simple answer is, of course. Anything that the researchers learn that could affect your health status, they should tell you. But biomedical ethicists say that it's a much more complicated picture than that, because many of these incidental findings, either there's nothing that you can do about them, so you're just causing the person grief and worry to no purpose, or two, the incidental findings may not be harmful, but the person in obtaining a better diagnosis may seek additional and unnecessary and sometimes invasive brain treatments, including brain surgeries, that they might not have needed to take. So for researchers, rather than for us as data users, that is an important ethical question about the uses of incidental neuroscientific data. Moving beyond the basic research context to some of the more directly legally related contexts of neuroscientific data collection and use. There are some fascinating questions that we will need to deal with as a legal community and as a society, and sensitive to Aurélia's view, a statement that she has a European view. Different societies will need to deal with this differently. So when I say our society, I'm conscious that I mean U.S. society, and I will try to say societies plural. About the use of EEG and fMRI as brain reading technologies. This raises the question of, can law enforcement search one's brain or search our thoughts? Several commercial corporations as well as government agencies are attempting to develop EEG protocols that can tell truth from falsehood and that, as I mentioned before, can determine whether a person is familiar with a particular stimulus that might be legally relevant, the gun, a bomb, the face of a suspect. Veritas Scientific Corporation, based in Massachusetts, has developed something called the Veritas helmet that can be placed on a subject's head. It's a portable, field-usable EEG helmet that can do these quick kinds of binary yes-no, truth-telling, lying determinations on a subject, including on an unwilling subject. This raises some accuracy concerns. How reliable is this kind of data? And I'll get to that at the end of the talk. But currently, it raises some constitutional questions. The questions that it raises arise under the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, and I'll talk about each of those briefly in turn. The Fourth Amendment protects the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. So, the Fourth Amendment gives us a qualified protection. We are freed from unreasonable searches of our person and unreasonable searches of our home and our other effects. This raises two questions. Is using an EEG technology to read somebody's brain waves from outside of their head a search in the first place? And if I take a picture of you on the street, that's not a search of you. You're freely displaying your face to the public. If I take, in effect, an EEG snapshot of the brain waves that you're sending out into the public space, is that a search? You're already emanating your brain waves out into space. I don't need to go into your brain to get your brain waves, in the same way that I do need to go into your body to take your blood or a saliva sample or a DNA swab. So it's unclear whether the Fourth Amendment will protect us from, or will it properly applies, to put it in a less inflammatory way, to detecting the brain waves that are emanated by all of us all the time using an EEG technology. If we do come to the legal and cultural interpretation that reading brain waves does constitute a search, and there's some constitutional law that would support the conclusion that it is a search, then we come to the next question under the Fourth Amendment. Would that be a reasonable search? And under what context would it be reasonable to invade somebody's mental privacy to search their brain for guilty knowledge about whether they recognize the gun or know the terrorism suspect? If such brain reading is not on its face unconstitutional, then all of these scans that could be performed on suspects or on witnesses or even potentially on victims to know what they know would produce data, and that would then raise questions about the use and storage of that data, particularly since investigations are far-ranging. Many people who wind up being subject to criminal investigation and criminal questioning are not guilty of anything. Of course, there's always the presumption of innocence until guilt is proven, but many people are not even suspects. And there are even fewer protections for data gathered about non-suspects than for criminal suspects, because constitutional criminal justice protections obtain as to the criminal suspect, him or herself only. So what would law enforcement then be able to do with all of this incidental data that it collects about suspects and non-suspects? There are regulations right now about DNA and about fingerprints, but not about brain-based data. And I would suggest that those will be very important to develop if and when these technologies come into broader use. Similarly, the Fifth Amendment provides a privilege against self-incrimination. If your thoughts can be detected without you needing to speak, I no longer need to ask Alistair, is this your gun? But I can use the Veritas helmet to get a brainwave reading on whether or not it is his gun. How does that affect his Fifth Amendment privilege to avoid self-incrimination? When I ask him, is this your gun, he can say, I decline to answer that on the grounds that it may incriminate me. He is invoking his Fifth Amendment privilege. But if I am reading his brainwaves, he is not engaged in a speech act. Therefore, he doesn't have the opportunity to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege. Current constitutional law holds that the Fifth Amendment privilege is what we call testimonial. It protects words, it protects speech. So I couldn't force Alistair to write the confession, this is my gun, or to answer questions about whether it's his gun. But the Fifth Amendment does not protect us from incriminating ourselves through that which is not testimonial, most particularly through our bodily substances. So if I'm pulled over for drunk driving, I don't have a Fifth Amendment privilege not to breathe into the breathalyzer. My alcoholic breath can incriminate me. My alcoholic blood can incriminate me. Are the electrical signals that our brains emanate more like blood and breath, not protected by the Fifth Amendment, mere bodily substances, even though they represent our thoughts? Or are the electrical signals and impulses that our brains emanate really just the precursor of speech, and therefore testimonial, and therefore properly protected by the Fifth Amendment? There are some powerful arguments on both sides. And if it is determined that brain signals are not testimonial, are not like speech, and therefore can be used against a subject without violating the Fifth Amendment privilege, then we need to really think about the collection, use, and restrictions on that kind of data as well, just as we were talking about in the Fourth Amendment context. Moving on to the uses of brain data in the courtroom, there are really 4 contexts in which brain-based data can come into the courtroom. And we could think of it as a matrix. In fact, probably the next time I do this, I should probably do a 4x4. We could think of a criminal trial or a civil trial, and then we could think of the brain-based data as being introduced by the party or against the party. So I'll give a few examples. We could take the square of this matrix, criminal case, data being introduced by the party. In a criminal case, a defendant might introduce data proactively himself about his own brain to show that he had a brain condition that made him less responsible or that provided a defense to his conduct, that he couldn't impede his own impulses, that he had impulse control disorder, or that he was not able to form the required criminal intent, the mens rea, for the crime for which he is charged. He could also introduce brain-based data after a finding of guilt at the sentencing phase as a plea for clemency or mitigation. The jury has concluded that he did have sufficient mental capacity to be held guilty of the offense for which he was charged, but he's now showing the court that because of his brain impairments, it's not fair to punish him as severely as a person who is neurologically intact. And this is the most common way that we're seeing neuroscientific evidence come into court. In the guilt phase, offered by a defendant to show lack of guilt, and in the sentencing phase to show why he should obtain clemency. However, once brain-based data is introduced by the defendant, it can also be introduced by the prosecution. And if if increasingly EEG-based technologies can be used in law enforcement investigations, such data could be introduced proactively by the prosecution, even without the defense introducing it itself. In the civil context, a person might introduce brain scans to show, a plaintiff might show impairment following a certain kind of accident or injury, and a defendant might also introduce brain scan data in the same way. The concern that remains constant in the civil context and the criminal context, and that is the same whether the data is introduced by the plaintiff or by the defendant or by the state, is that court records are public documents. And so any information or evidence introduced at trial can be a matter of public, or is a matter of public record and can be searchable. We have been relying for centuries on privacy by obscurity for evidence introduced at trial and for trial transcripts. They were paper-based, they were in filing rooms, they were in basements, and good luck going to find it even if you were avidly interested in it. We can no longer rely on privacy by obscurity, and so this should give us a concern about many types of information introduced at trial, and neuroscientific information is just one particularly sensitive case for why we should be concerned about the growing absence of privacy by obscurity for trial evidence. The next context, and I think it's one of the most important legal contexts for the use of neuroscientific information, is going to be in parole determinations. So a little bit of criminal law background. Probation and parole are frequently used interchangeably. They're a little bit different. Probation is the disposition frequently awarded to people who are not particularly dangerous, misdemeanor crimes, low-level offenses, and a court says, we will not sentence you to any term of incarceration. We're going to let you out and just give you a period of supervision. It's a little bit of a test. That's why it's called probation, probative. And if you do wrong while you're out on probation, then we'll incarcerate you. Parole comes rather differently at the end of a term of incarceration. The person has been sentenced to a term of, say, 10 years, and a parole board is making a determination about whether he or she should be released on good behavior after 6 or 7 years, or conversely, if the person is still dangerous, is there a good rationale for holding him or her for an additional length of time. So parole boards make determinations about people who've committed more serious crimes and frequently about people who have committed violent offenses. So they're in the business of making risk predictions. Historically, they make risk predictions really, really badly. Psychiatrists are worse than chance at predicting future dangerousness and future criminal activity, and parole boards are worse than psychiatrists. So anything that we can do to improve the accuracy of parole determinations would be beneficial for the individual incarcerated person who might not be dangerous and might deserve to be released into the community. And it's important for us as taxpayers, because if we simply kept everybody in prison for the maximum amount of their sentence, we would be paying literally billions of dollars more per year than we already are for our incarceration costs in the U.S., which has one of the highest percentages of incarcerated population in the world. So parole determinations matter. We do it badly. How can we do it better? One of the ways that we might be able to do it better, at least in offender populations whose future risk we might be highly concerned about, is through brain scans. A powerful new paper by Eyal Aharoni and Kent Keel, just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, has presented some really robust data that there is a neurological signal that highly correlates with risk of reoffense amongst incarcerated psychopathic dangerous offenders, the population that we might have the most concern about. This image on the slide is not from their paper, but I picked it because it was the clearest illustration I could find of the portion of the brain that is the target for predicting reoffense. This little yellow area, and if I move my cursor, I don't know if the participants can see it, but I'm now tracing that area with my cursor, is called the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. The ACC is sometimes described as the traffic cop of the brain, or the error and conflict mediation center of the brain. It's a part of the brain that becomes active when you have to mediate between two conflicting pieces of information or two conflicting impulses. I'll give you a quick example. Let's say I really need to get someplace fast. I've just gotten a call from my nanny or my daycare center that my daughter has had a serious accident and I need to come immediately. So I have the strongest incentive in the world to get there fast. As I'm driving there, I come to a yellow light in a heavily trafficked intersection. I need to make a split-second decision about whether I run the light to get to my daughter or whether I stop because I could cause a serious accident if I run the yellow light. It's the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, that's going to show the greatest degree of activation in a healthy typical brain as a person tries to mediate that instantaneous conflict. That's why we call it the traffic cop of the brain. Now, interestingly, in people who have a long history of criminal recidivism, the ACC shows less activity on conflict mediation tasks in an fMRI scanner. And we're not even talking about tasks like, should you rob this person or should you not rob this person? We're talking about very simple conflict mediation. For example, the researcher asks you to pay attention only to the blue dot, and then suddenly a distracting flashing red dot comes onto the screen. In the typical person, the ACC becomes active, helps you screen out the red dot stimulus. You focus more on the blue dot. In people with long histories of criminal reoffense that were the study population within this paper, the ACC does not become active, and the subject is much more distractible and makes what look like poor choices, but choice may be the wrong word. It may be just baseline neurological activity to attend to irrelevant stimulus or, in effect, to do the wrong thing. This might be the kind of data that could help parole boards make much more accurate determinations. Yay, that's a good thing. On the other hand, a correlative brain signature is not the same as behavior, and we might have a concern that a person's neurological preset is going to be used against him or her as an overly strong predictor of future behavior in minority report-like way, where a person is in effect being punished in advance for behavior they have not yet committed because we're looking at a pattern of brain activity that merely correlates and correlates imperfectly with a potential increased future risk. So this is one example of the kinds of brain prediction that we're going to see more and more of that has a certain amount of exciting promise, but that also raises tremendous ethical concerns about individual liberty and freedom, and about the ways that brain data could be used against us going forward, which is why I've now clicked to employment. Parole is relevant only to criminal offenders. Most of us are not criminal offenders. Almost all of us, however, will be employed in the course of our adult lives. If we have something like a brain signature for risk of recidivism because of poor activity or what looks like poorer control in the anterior cingulate cortex, who else might be interested in that? Well, if I'm an employer entrusting people with high-risk types of jobs, I might be very interested in their degree of self-control, personal control. What if I'm hiring drivers for my Brinks delivery trucks, or security guards for my high-stakes enterprise, whatever it is, or daycare workers to look after children, or military personnel who are being entrusted with the nuclear launch codes. Pick any high-risk scenario that you might care to think of. It is quite conceivable that employers would be interested in knowing what's going on in the potential employee's brain, not just what he or she says in an interview. And this sounds science fiction-y, but it's not just science fiction. There are several commercial corporations that are making this their business. I've just clicked over to a slide for a corporation called No Lie MRI. Their logo is a little small up in the upper left-hand corner, but that's where you see their name, No Lie MRI. It's sort of a catchy name. And you see this big fMRI scanner, and No Lie fMRI is offering what it calls, here on the slide, new truth verification technology. It offers its services to law enforcement and to corporations, to lawyers and litigators, and even to people who might suspect their partners of infidelity. You can bring them in for a brain scan. And this is taken from their site, from the tab that is talking about corporations as customers. And I think it's worth reading out. It says, U.S. law prohibits truth verification lie detection testing for employees that is based on measuring the autonomic nervous system, e.g. polygraph testing. No Lie MRI measures the central nervous system directly, and as such is not subject to restriction by these laws. No Lie MRI is unaware of any law that would prohibit its use for employment screening. So in other words, we can't use conventional lie detector machines, but we can use brain reading machines, even though they are not demonstrated to be any more accurate at this point than polygraph. No Lie MRI is not the only corporation. There's also Kifos. The Veritas Corporation currently is aimed only at law enforcement, but could potentially be used for employment as well. So this raises tremendous privacy concerns on the ingoing side, and tremendous data management concerns on the outgoing side. In addition to the ethical and data management concerns, I want to raise some accuracy concerns because the two are not divorced from each other. People who are true privacy advocates might see them as truly independent. Many people, however, who think about privacy and data security in a more casual way might ask the question, well, if a brain scan shows the person is a pedophile, obviously they should never work with children, and everybody should be made aware of the results of this brain scan, because do you want your neighbor to be a pedophile? So I want to address a little bit of that kind of thinking, which is driven by accuracy. A person might want to know if their neighbor had a pedophile brain scan, but what if the accuracy isn't that great? Could we be sentencing people in court or in the court of public opinion to serious negative consequences from outputs of these neuroscientific technologies when they might not even have very strong predictive or diagnostic validity? So there's a tremendous problem with, first, false positives and false negatives. False positives are the bigger problem when we think in a Bayesian way about base rates. The targets that we're screening for, psychopathic personality, pedophilia, risk of being a terrorist, are extremely low in the population. And so even a quite low rate of false positives is going to produce more false positives than true hits when we're dealing with a low base rate condition. There's also a reverse inference problem. Just because we see a signature in brain pattern activity that might be shared with people who in the lab demonstrate a particular condition like psychopathic personality doesn't mean that every person whose brain demonstrates that pattern also has psychopathic personality. This leads us to the unknown base rates problem. We don't know how often, because we haven't scanned every brain in the culture and we don't have a large database, we don't know how often particular patterns of activation, say reduced amygdalar activity in the face of an emotional stimulus, occurs in the absence of psychopathic personality. We can say in people with psychopathic personality, we see reduced amygdalar activation. We cannot make the reverse inference that reduced amygdalar activation is often or always found in people who have psychopathic personality, because it might be quite prevalent and we just don't know because we haven't tested everyone. Correlation causation problem, I think, is relatively obvious. And then there's a slightly less obvious problem that I call a skewing problem, or to use the familiar old phrase, looking under the lamppost because that's where the light is. You know, the old story of the drunk who loses his keys, and he's looking under the lamppost, and the police officer asks him, well, did you lose your keys under the lamppost? And he says, no, but it's dark out, and this is where the light is, so this is where I can see. So what do I mean by that in relation to neuroscientific data? Because brain scans are a sexy new technology, because science speaks with an aura of authority, and because we have the ability now to focus on the brain in a way that we never did before. And finally, because we, and this is a cultural trope and not a necessary way of thinking, we identify the brain most closely with the self, although neurological activity and mind, their relationship is as yet vigorously undetermined and the subject of tremendous philosophical speculation. We have a tendency to look at a picture of the brain and say, oh, well, that's truth, when that is one very small component of the factors that we might otherwise care about. So let's say we're talking about the reliability and trustworthiness of a person who is being considered to guard the nuclear launch codes. We can put him in the brain scanner. We can see that he has excellent conflict mediation in his anterior cingulate cortex. We can see that he has excellent executive function and self-control based on measuring certain prefrontal cortical tasks. We could put him through every battery of brain tests that we might care about. But that might not be the most important thing. What we might really care about is, what are his politics? Who are his friends? What are his personal and moral commitments? Is he a pacifist? Is he a Quaker who believes that violence is unjustifiable under any circumstances? None of that will show up on a brain scan. And so as we think about using brain data, and in some cases enthusiasm for the power of brain data, we also might think about the ways in which it can provide us with a radically incomplete picture. That said, while brain imaging may give us an inaccurate picture of the person, wait, do I have another slide after this? No, sorry, let me go back to my prior slide. We might also want to think carefully about the relationship between what we think of as the brain and what we think of as the person, and how the brain image is not the person. How does this relate to data privacy, and data use? It relates to data privacy and data use because if neuroscientific data produced in all of these contexts that we've talked about, from basic research through law enforcement to the courtroom to criminal justice determinations like parole up through employment, become widely used, there will be a tendency to look at the brain data in making important determinations about who we hire or fire, who we incarcerate, possibly who we love. If you've brought your sweetie into no-lie FMRI to figure out if they're cheating on you. And yet, brain is not behavior, and brain is not mind. Brain is also not social context. We are Brain data can be very important, but it is one piece of the mosaic of understanding who a person is. And so an over-reliance on brain data could be terribly skewing. And therefore, I would suggest that the possibility of over-reliance on this skewing data is a strong argument for protecting it, limiting its access, and making sure that if and when it's used, it's always placed in context. Thanks. And I'd love to open this up to questions if we have time for any of them. I know that I spoke at some length.
No, that was amazing. I mean, I think I have to say I've been running these things for 2 or 3 years. This is one of the most mind-blowing back-to-back sessions I've seen. These are really good. And I love the fact that we've actually come at it from a variety of different angles, not just sort of one approach, but looking at it from sort of biomedical stuff and cookies and so on. I'd say things like "you blew my mind" or "I need a tinfoil hat," but those are probably frighteningly close to accurate statements. So let's take a couple of quick questions. I know we've still got a bunch of people online, and we will be distributing these as recordings, which I'm really happy about because obviously this needs a broader audience that it's getting today too. Going through quickly, how soon might it become possible to identify an individual by some kind of MRI fingerprint?
So that's fingerprinting is a powerful metaphor, and people in the brain research space talk about what they call brain fingerprinting. But the way that I've heard it used is not actually to identify a person, which I think makes the phrase brain fingerprinting misleading. The brain fingerprinting literature that I'm familiar with talks about brain fingerprinting as a way of, or as a metaphor for, how to determine if you've gotten the right suspect, but not for how to identify a person based on his or her unique and characteristic pattern of brainwaves. So since everybody has a unique brain, by definition, if our brains were the same, we would be the same people or substantially similar people. So there might be an Alistair brain signature and an Amanda brain signature that differ from each other. And it may be possible in the future to identify people based on unique patterns of brainwaves. But the companies that sell brain, quote-unquote, fingerprinting technologies are doing truth verification. They're doing what I was talking about in relation to that Veritas helmet and EEG testing. It's if I present the criminal suspect with a fact that only the perpetrator of the crime could have known, does his brain ping in response to that? And that, in some ways, is nothing like a fingerprint at all, because it's not telling me who is this person uniquely. Is this Alistair or is it Amanda? It's telling me, is this suspect familiar with this information, or is this suspect lying to me when he denies being familiar with this information? The only way that that's like a fingerprint is that it helps you catch your man or woman in your investigation.
Okay, good answer. And I guess you talked about deduplication, sort of de-anonymization, so brain fingerprinting, if we're ever able to do it, would give you the ability to sort of de-anonymize data and make it easier to associate a particular record with a particular person. Richard has another good question here. We've tended to assume that things are legal until prevented. Certainly in the case of common law, there's the law sort of builds on itself and evolves over time, as opposed to code law, which is more European approaches, tends to be this is what is permitted and so on. With technology advancing so fast, do we need to start thinking that something new becoming possible should be legal until allowed? Can you talk about the, balancing the need to innovate and change? And certainly, if you're talking about creating, new life forms, that's probably already pretty heavily regulated. Where's the law in terms of giving, asking for permission versus asking for forgiveness?
That's a great question, and the notion that it's legal until it's prohibited is absolutely right, which is why law is so frequently a lagging indicator in so many of these important discussions about data and code, about privacy, and generally about new technologies. The way that we would have, I talked earlier about the Fourth and Fifth Amendment and brain privacy. The only way you'd ever have a Supreme Court case rule on the Fourth or Fifth Amendment implications of the use of these technologies is if they are not legally prohibited, and they're currently not legally prohibited. If they're used, that's the person upon whom they were used objects to them. That's appealed up through the courts until there's a Supreme Court case on it. It could be 10 years or longer from the time that the technology is first used until there's a Supreme Court ruling. And that's exactly what happened in India, where EEG-based, or what you might call brain fingerprinting technologies, were being used in criminal investigations. There was a very famous case where a woman was convicted of murdering her fiancé based on an EEG test that apparently proved that she had familiarity with the poison. And she was going to be eligible, I believe, for the death penalty until the Indian Supreme Court recently ruled that these kinds of technologies cannot be used any longer against the defendant's will in a criminal investigation, but can be used if the defendant consents to their use. We haven't gotten to any legislation in the U.S. or any court rulings, and that's why I think we need to get out in front of this, just like we did with DNA. The discussions around brain privacy are now at a place where they were about DNA in the 1980s, and we saw legislation that prevented employers and insurance companies from gaining access to your DNA profile and discriminating on the basis of your DNA, maybe showing that you had a predisposition to Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease or something like that. And I would suggest that the time is ripe now to do preventative legislation that provides the same kinds of protection to brain-based measures of health and of mental function.
Okay. You touched on this a little bit, but so you may have covered it, but I'll read it here. It's an interesting way of putting it. Ray Gustas says, in these discussions of determining whether a person has knowledge of something, isn't there an element missing of how the person chooses to act on the information? So I think this is to your point about just because I have a certain proclivity doesn't mean I would act on it, and this really is the Minority Report model, right? Is there any legislation that says, look, it's intent rather than the knowledge that is the thing that will incarcerate you?
Certainly. So I'd like to tease apart two issues in that question. They're two very, very good, important issues. The first is knowledge, and the second is propensity or indication of mental disorder. So the way knowledge would come into play would be as one piece of evidence in proving a case against a person in a criminal matter. You claim that you've never fired a gun, and therefore you couldn't have been the shooter in this case. However, when you were presented with stimuli in the context of a neurological exam, your brain pattern indicates that you have fired a gun. We're now going to introduce that as evidence against you to show that you're lying when you say that you haven't fired a gun. And so the state still needs to prove every element of its case. It needs to prove that you were in the place at the time that you knew the victim, that you fired the gun. The brain-based piece that shows knowledge would be one of the pieces of evidence introduced in a trial or used in a plea bargaining context to achieve a conviction. So a person couldn't be convicted just based on a brain scan showing knowledge, but that could be one of the bricks in a wall that leads to that conclusion. Moving to intent, which I think the questioner was asking about, that raises some equally important but different issues. Intent and risk are something that are forward-going projections. We might say that a person whose brain scan indicates that he shows arousal in response to child pornography is more likely to be at risk of abusing a child than a person whose brain scan doesn't show that predilection. But it is unlawful to incarcerate somebody for something that they have not yet done. That really is Minority Report. So we can't punish a person for thought crime or for predispositions. What we can do is if a person is already incarcerated, has already been convicted of a crime, we lawfully could use that kind of information predictively to make a judgment about who is more likely to be dangerous and to commit a future offense if or when he is released from prison. And that raises questions about fairness in the parole process. That predictive use of brain scanning information also raises questions in the employment technology and in the surveillance context. I can't arrest you for conduct that you haven't yet engaged in, but could I surveil you? Could I say, not Alistair, but Alistair's evil twin brother, has a brain scan indicative of arousal in response to child pornography. We can't incarcerate him for what he hasn't yet done, but we would like to put a tracking monitor on him. We'd like to preventatively enroll him in a pedophile anger management workshop or something like that. I'm making that up. That would not be currently prohibited by our criminal law. So those are some issues that are worth thinking through as we have a conversation about the appropriate use of brain scanning technologies in law enforcement, and then the appropriate downstream use of data that any such screening technologies might produce. Hello? Hello?
That was awesome. Cord said there was a great spectrum between sort of Skynet on the one side and Singularity on the other. And I think I talked about sort of we all have to live together and understand we're all freaks. And you said the state now has the tools to detect all the freaks and coerce them to moving towards the middle. So there's definitely a hugely controversial amount of information. I think we spent a great 2 hours talking about them online. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. This was really, really interesting, and hopefully we can continue the conversation on the Strata blog, at some of the conferences, and online. So thank you all, Orly, for giving us the European perspective on this, which I think is interesting and certainly contrarian to those in North America that don't necessarily think of this stuff as enforced by the state. Thank you to Cord for giving us some business and pragmatism, and thank you, Amanda, for making me want to go put my tinfoil hat on. This was an amazing set of conversations, guys. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you.
Thanks, Orly and Cord. It was terrific.
Likewise, very nice.
Amanda. Thank you, Cord.
Great. And on behalf of O'Reilly Media, we'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Alistair, for organizing today's online conference. A big thank you to all of our speakers today. And, of course, a very big thank you to all of our attendees. And we hope you benefited from today's event. And also thank you to those of you that sent in your questions. We had great questions today, lots of great activity in the group chat. And having all that really adds just that much more to our event. So we thank you for it. Folks, this will conclude today's online conference. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.